Good morning, everyone. We're letting folks filter in and then we'll get started in just a minute. It's great to see you all. Thank you for joining us. We're just letting folks join and then we'll get going. Give folks a minute. Welcome everyone who's joined. We're just letting folks log on and we'll get started in about a minute. All right, well, I know folks are still joining, but we've got so much good stuff to talk to you about today. So let's get going. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's so lovely to see so many people on the webinar. I'm Megan Maddock. I'm a project manager at John Burton Advocates for Youth, and welcome to our webinar on College Costs Uncovered. We're excited to talk to you about our new report today, cost of attendance, and all the implications for student success. And as you are probably familiar with, we're going to start with some webinar housekeeping. We will be recording this webinar and posting it online at jbay.org after the session, probably sometime later this week. So if you have colleagues who missed it, you can send them on over to our website. You're welcome to use the closed captioning function or turn it off. You can find that setting at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit questions at any time during using the Q&A function on Zoom. You'll also see that link down there at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be waiting till the end of the session to take questions, but feel free to submit questions at any time as they come up as you're listening. So as I mentioned, I'm Megan, but I'm joined today by many wonderful panelists. We have two student experts on the call today, Erin Clues, who is a youth advocate and mentor with JBAY, and Crystal Pale, who is a student parent, an advisor for the California Alliance for Student Parent Success, and a consultant for Urban Institute. So we're so excited to have both these student experts with us on the call today to share their experiences and tell you more about how they interacted with cost attendance. And I want to note, they coincidentally happen to be both from UC Santa Cruz. We are not picking on UC Santa Cruz. We love our banana slugs. It was just a total coincidence. So we're happy to have UC Santa Cruz represented on the call today through our students. We'll also have Ella Bastone here from San Francisco State Guardian Scholars Program, who will talk to us about her experiences supporting students through the cost of attendance adjustment process. So I introduced myself already, but I will turn it over to my colleague Laura, who will tell you a little bit about herself.
Thank you so much, Megan, and welcome everyone. My name is Laura Szabo-Kubitz, and I'm thrilled to have been able to work on this project with JBAY. Having spent the last nearly 20 years of my career at TCAS and also now as a consultant focusing on strengthening college affordability, this research was really a natural fit given the role that cost of attendance budgets play in the amount of financial aid that students can receive. So very happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Laura. And we will dive right in with our presentation today. We are very excited that the report has been published. You can find it on our website. Please take the time to read it and learn more about the work that we did through this research. Before we start on our agenda, I just want to acknowledge the many folks who contributed to this research, the report and the research and what you'll hear today. We want to thank staff from the California Student Aid Commission and staff and faculty from the California Public Higher Education Systems, all who provided insight and support in writing this report. We also want to highlight Dr. Robert Kelchin, who reviewed our report. He's one of the leading cost of attendance researchers in the United States, and we're very lucky to have his eyes on the report. And of course, we could not do the work without the generous support of our funders. So we want to acknowledge the Angel Foundation, the College Futures Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation for providing the necessary resources for us to do this work. So today we'll be talking about cost of attendance and what it is and why it's important to student success. We'll be giving you an overview of our research questions and the methodology we employed in the report. And of course, and most exciting, we'll be reviewing our findings and recommendations based on that research. And as I mentioned, we'll be having time for questions at the end of the session, but please submit your Q&A, your questions as we go along. So I'll go ahead and pass it to my colleague Laura to give us an overview about cost of attendance.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. So without question, college is unaffordable for many students, and particularly those with the least resources. And while crucial work is being done to strengthen need-based financial aid to ensure all Californians can afford to earn a higher education credential, a less understood issue is higher education institutions' differing approaches to setting cost of attendance budgets, which impact how much financial aid students can receive. The cost of attendance is an institution of higher education's determination of what a student has to pay to attend that college in a given year, and includes both tuition and non-tuition expenses. The federal government requires that institutions create cost of attendance budgets for specific circumstances, including attendance status like full-time and part-time, and housing arrangements such as living on campus, living with family, and living off campus independently. But there is little individualization beyond those circumstances. Standardizing the costs for diverse student populations presents a challenge, as critical expenses that some students incur, such as childcare and healthcare, may not be included in budgets developed for the broader student population. While the specific cost categories, including tuition and fees, housing and food, books and supplies, transportation, and miscellaneous personal expenses, are set by the Federal Higher Education Act, institutions have flexibility in both what specifically is included and how they determine the expected cost for each category. For example, one higher ed institution may choose to include rent for a one-bedroom apartment and utilities under housing costs, while another only includes rent for a shared two-bedroom apartment. Cost of attendance budgets are critical to college affordability in that, alongside a student's student aid index, or SAI, which is how much they and their family are expected to contribute to college costs, they determine the maximum amount of financial aid that a student can receive. For example, if a student's total cost of attendance is $30,000 and their student aid index, or SAI, is $10,000, then they can receive up to $30,000 in non-need-based financial aid and up to $20,000 in need-based financial aid. But anything beyond that, they cannot accept. So how do colleges determine their cost of attendance? Schools choose to set amounts for each cost of attendance element utilizing a variety of sources, which may include estimates provided by state agencies, federal and proprietary data sets, and student surveys. In California, each public post-secondary system takes a different approach to how cost of attendance budgets are calculated. The community colleges have no system-wide universal recommended methodology, and many do use student expense budgets produced by the California Student Aid Commission based on student responses to its Student Expenses and Resources Survey, or SEERS. The California State University Chancellor's Office provides individual campuses with Sears data based on regional costs and also gives campuses the option to use their own documented figures. And the University of California system employs its own methodology to determine individual campus cost of attendance budgets for undergraduate students using information from its cost of attendance surveys, along with administrative data regarding direct college costs. While institutions set their standardized student budgets, students can submit an appeal to increase their cost of attendance, which financial aid administrators have the authority to adjust using something called professional judgment on a documented case-by-case basis. In fact, under the recent FAFSA Simplification Act, all institutions are now required to take steps to promote professional judgment and are no longer allowed to deny all requests of a specific type or to set deadlines by which students must submit requests. Cost of attendance adjustments are critical to college affordability and student success because they can give students access to financial aid they may not otherwise be able to receive. Take, for example, a student whose college's published cost of attendance is $30,000, like we saw a few slides back, but whose actual expenses, when including, say, costs related to a disability, like note-taking services or medication, are actually $32,000. If that student has a student aid index or SAI of $10,000, they can receive up to $30,000 in total financial aid and $20,000 in need-based aid. What this means is that if they're offered additional financial aid to help cover the $2,000 in disability related costs, they would not be able to accept a financial aid professional judgment request. Next
Laura,
slide. About,
you're
can you
having
not
a
hear me?
you're having a little bit of issues
Oh,
cutting in and out. So
oh
I just wanted to.
shoot. Okay. Thank you for letting me know that. Let me see if I take out my AirPods, if that helps. Oh no, is this better? Can you all hear me now?
That sounds better.
Is it
Let's try it and see what happens.
okay? Thank you for letting me know. I'm so sorry about that, everybody. Should I back up at all?
Let's start where like where you're talking about if they were offered the $2,000 additional.
Got it. Okay. Apologies, everybody. I did not know that I was having an issue. Thank you. Okay. So, as I was saying, cost of attendance adjustments are critical to college affordability and student success because they can give students access to financial aid they might not otherwise be able to receive. So, as we saw a couple of slides back, a student whose college's published cost of attendance is $30,000, but whose actual expenses when including, for example, costs related to a disability like note-taking services or medication is actually $32,000. If that student has an SAI or student aid index of 10,000, as mentioned, they can only receive up to $30,000 in total financial aid and $20,000 in need-based aid. So what this means is that if they're offered additional financial aid to help cover the $2,000 in disability-related costs, they would not be able to receive it unless the financial aid office exercises professional judgment to approve the student's cost of attendance adjustment request. So it's very important that we have cost of attendance budgets that are accurately reflecting what students are actually paying. And can you all hear me better now? Just doing a little check. Okay.
Yes, much better.
So sorry. Okay, wonderful. So to share more about her own experiences with requesting cost of attendance adjustments, I'd like to introduce Crystal Paule, student parent and advisor for the California Alliance for Student Parent Success and consultant for Urban Institute under Sparks Collaborative. Crystal is currently getting her master's degree at the University of San Francisco and is a recent alumna of UC Santa Cruz. So thank you so much, Crystal, for joining us today. We're really happy to have you here. And maybe we could start if you could just tell us a little bit briefly about yourself and your family.
Thank you for inviting me. As you mentioned, I'm Crystal Bale, and I have 5 children. I'm currently pursuing my master's degree. I'm a transfer student from American River College from Sacramento to UCSC, and then now at the University of San Francisco. My youngest is 6 years old, and pursuing higher education is not easy. Sometimes I have to work as a CNA to make ends meet if the financial aid doesn't cover it.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. So, as a student parent, I'm assuming you probably have expenses that go beyond those that would be in a college's standard cost of attendance budget. For you, how accurately did your college's cost of attendance budget reflect your undergraduate expenses?
It wasn't very accurate at all. It failed to account for many costs unique to student parents, especially for large families like mine.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And could you share like a couple examples if you're comfortable about like what these additional expenses were?
Yeah, so for the childcare was one of the major expenses. So including the after school care. So especially for those evening and early morning classes, um, I would have to come out of pocket to hire somebody to either come or ask like a family member to come and help me with that, or like summer programs that would help with taking care of the kids or for that extra study time or exams, healthcare expenses like over-the-counter medications, unexpected medical expenses not covered by Medicaid. Also, for my children, their school supplies, books, technology needed for their education, transportation costs for additional fuel costs from running back and forth to school, parking permits. Because it's hard for us to go back home and park at home and then try to catch the bus while trying to make it to class. Um, Higher grocery
Yeah.
expenses due to inflation, yeah, and just feeding a larger family, clothes for the kids because you know that they do grow fast. Um, so those are just some of them.
Yes, I'm a parent of a small child, and I know how much all of those costs can add up really quickly. And it sounds like from when we were talking before, you actually were offered financial aid that initially you had to turn away because you had hit your cost of attendance ceiling. And so, given these additional expenses, you filed cost of attendance adjustment requests. What was that process like for you? Did you have to do it every year? Was it straightforward? Was it difficult?
It was super tedious. It's like the ongoing collecting of papers, putting it in, getting rejected. Um, I would also it takes a lot of emotional strength as well, because I feel that I would have to like get myself emotionally ready. So I would just wait last minute until I couldn't anymore and start the process. But it's super tedious. It felt like every year, and every summer as well, because that's another cost of attendance that you have to do in the summer. So recently I had to do it this summer. A lot of things were rejected, but some were accepted. So even though I got the cost of attendance adjustment, I had to reject a lot of the awards that I was being given by other resources on campus.
So it sounds like then the adjust like because some of your adjustments were accepted, you were able to access some of that aid you were offered, but because not all of your adjustments were accepted, you had to they rejected some of that aid. It was a mixed bag.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. I mean, hearing directly from students like yourself is like crucial to understanding the changes we need to make to better support college affordability. And lastly, I'll just, would love to ask you from your perspective, what would make the cost of attendance adjustment process easier for students?
Well, actually, I wanted to give kudos that the Gaines Act was signed by the governor. And so that would streamline the cost of attendance budget, making it super easy for student parents. But also too, if we even needed to widen the COA then, just having training for financial aid staff, a dedicated advisor for student parents, also more flexible documentation requirements for widening our COA, and transparency, I think, is very important.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I think those are all excellent things to point out. And as you mentioned, the governor did sign AB 2458, the Gains for Student Parents Act, on Monday, which is really exciting and will essentially require most colleges and universities to automatically include a dependent care allowance for student parents. There's many categories of students, including recent foster youth, those experiencing homelessness, et cetera, who have access to additional financial aid and often hit their cost of attendance ceilings. So for those students, there's additional work that we need to be doing to make sure they can access all of their aid. But thank you again. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
So next, we are going to hear from Ella Bastone, Program Coordinator for the SF State Guardian Scholars Program that supports students who are recent foster youth. And as I was just mentioning, when we were doing this report, we were also looking at certain populations of students who often have access to additional pots of funding and can hit their their school's cost of attendance and not be able to access all of the aid for which they're eligible because they've hit that ceiling. So as I mentioned, Ella is the program coordinator for this Guardian Scholars Program, and a part of her role is to help students in her program navigate the cost of attendance adjustment process. So welcome, Ella, and could you please share a little bit about what that's been like?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Laura. Good to be with you all. As Laura mentioned, I'm the coordinator for the San Francisco State Guardian Scholars Program, supporting current and former foster youth. So the cost of attendance, we run into this challenge a lot where a student has possible funding that they're able to receive, whether it be something coming from our program, another support program on campus, something in the community, or maybe even some sort of state or federal grant, like the Chafee grant. And the student is just hit their max budget for the year. And then it's kind of a scramble for us to try to figure out how can we increase their cost of attendance. And what I find is that, we have folks who are allies to us in our financial aid office, but they're also bound by their own kind of policies and concerns. So even if they really want to support students getting access to some of this funding, we may still run into issues of how do we get, the documentation needed to advocate for the increase in the cost of attendance. And we have some students who run into this, almost every year and miss out on, can only receive $400 of their Chafee grant, but the rest of the funding is right there. And the process itself, I will just say, even as somebody who's in this position as a staff person, the process sometimes supporting a student, gathering the documentation, submitting it, can just be really frustrating. And so if I'm feeling that way as a staff person, I know how students are feeling too. So that's challenging to navigate it like any bureaucratic kind of process. And it can feel kind of defeating for students because maybe they've worked really hard to apply for a scholarship and then they just aren't able to receive the funds. We work as closely as we can with financial aid, but they might have limited capacity, and they're also just limited in their own ways.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. So from your perspective in working with many students who encounter this issue, what would make the cost of attendance adjustment process easier for students?
Yeah. So
And
my
are there things that people in your position, sorry, I just
Oh, no,
interrupted
no,
you,
no.
other things people in your position
I just got excited to answer it.
Yeah, no, well, and also things you people in your position can do to help, but I will be quiet now.
Yeah. Because we collaborate a lot within the CSU, so I'm often, using my colleagues who are in similar positions to mine at other CSUs, like, what can we do? How do we kind of work together? What kind of advocacy have you been able to do? And a lot of our programs are just running into the same issue. We're really grateful because we've been able to receive some state funding recently for foster youth programs at college campuses, but we're all struggling with how we actually get the funds that we have directly to students to support them. So I have this like, kind of dream where it would be so awesome if I know Crystal mentioned like so much of what they were sharing was resonating with me, obviously. They mentioned like more flexible documentation. And I think it would just be so awesome if there could be a signed statement that comes from a foster youth representative at at the CSU or at the given college who can say, I've kind of worked with this student. I have a sense of what their needs are, and this can serve as documentation. Because, otherwise students have to really kind of they have to do a lot of work. They have to do a lot of gathering their receipts. Maybe they have to obtain a lease, and they have to kind of prove that their current costs exceed what the university or has allotted for each given category. And it's also just a lot of time and like on the student, time and effort for the student. So if there's a way where I can meet with a student and say, we've been working together, for 3 years, I know their needs really well, and here's what I can say they need support with, and a signed statement from me and the student together might be able to serve as some documentation. I think that would make a real world of difference. And for our students, one thing we talk about for foster youth is that a lot of our students are receiving all of their financial support from stuff that has to be reported to financial aid. They don't often, some other students might have somebody in their life who they hit a rough patch and they say, oh, I don't have enough for my PG&E bill. And maybe they have someone in their life who sends them a Venmo, something that doesn't have to be reported to financial aid. But, for us, it's like, a lot of our students are connected to state funding, federal funding, community funding, and mostly all of it has to be reported to the financial aid office, even things like gift cards for emergency groceries. So it just really, really limits, that this is kind of a tough situation for our students. And I think just having to navigate another system with a lot of bureaucracy and a lack of transparency, like Crystal was saying, it's really confusing for students. Like, why did I get approved for this scholarship, but I can't actually get the money? And we know for our foster youth students, that can be a re-traumatizing experience. There's the system getting in the way of a resource that I earned or that I worked for, I was told I would receive. So anything we can do to kind of eliminate that, I think is really, really awesome. And it's good for our universities too, because it means that, students can have more support to continue their time here and hopefully achieve their degree in, a 5-year or so timeline.
Well, thank you so much, Ella, for all that you do and, all the tremendous support that you give your fellow students and the coordination among your colleagues. I think you really hit something about intergenerational wealth, right? That, not all students are able to have a family member or friend they can turn to when they're in a tight spot. And so that's certainly something that can be really significant. And then also, just wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, although I'm worried it didn't get heard because my audio was choppy, under the recent um, FAFSA simplification act, colleges are allowed, or financial aid offices are allowed to have a documented like conversation between a student and a financial aid administrator count as like acceptable documentation. And so I think, like, to your point that, like, what you want to do is almost, would go hand in hand with what's already allowed, and would facilitate that for the students. So thank you again for joining us and for all the great work you're doing.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Well, great. So now I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who's going to be sharing about our research and our analysis methodology.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thank you so much, Ella and Crystal. That was just amazing to hear the stories and how you're working on these issues every day. We really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. Yes, like Laura mentioned, I'll be talking about our research today, which is exciting to share with you all. So for our report, College Costs Uncovered, we were really looking at two research questions. So one, are the cost of attendance budgets published by California colleges and universities accurate? Do they represent what it costs to actually live and attend school in their given community in California? We also looked at how accessible cost of attendance adjustment policies are to students. So some of the things that Crystal and Ella were talking about. We wanted to see how colleges are informing students about their cost of attendance adjustment policies, what their process looks like, and what type of adjustments are allowable. And to do this, we have used three methods. So first, we developed a methodology to estimate non-tuition costs for students who live off campus independently. So we did this using publicly available data sources that reflected regional California costs whenever possible. So this included developing costs for food and housing, transportation, books and supplies, and miscellaneous personal expenses. We then compared the budgets that we developed using this methodology to the budgets that were published by the public colleges and universities in California. We also reviewed each individual campus website for all of these colleges and universities to identify, well, first to identify their published cost of attendance budget, and then also to understand their cost of attendance adjustment policies as well. And finally, we interviewed financial aid administrators and foster youth program staff at all three systems to better understand how cost of attendance budgets are determined at their campus and how adjustments are handled in their financial aid office. We included, as Laura mentioned, foster youth program staff just to emphasize the disproportionate impact of cost of attendance limits on those particular students, which you heard about earlier from Ella. So I'm going to dive into our data sources that we use to develop this methodology. So again, we developed kind of our a report budget that included the same costs and expenses as those published by the universities. To develop our food and housing costs, we used 50th percentile rents for a 2-bedroom apartment published by Housing and Urban Development, HUD, for each individual California county. Utilities and food expenses we sourced from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey data for California. So this survey data tracks consumer spending habits of adults and families in the US, and it provides tons of information on annual expenditures for all sorts of activities and household needs. We also included internet, very important for college education, in the cost of housing and utilities. And we sourced this from Broadband Now, which has a database that provides the lowest cost internet plan for each California county. Transportation is a tricky one. We acknowledge that transportation needs are going to vary by region, by campus, by individual student circumstance. You heard from Crystal earlier talking about her necessity to have a car to be able to drive and meet her education needs, her job needs, and her children's needs. But we also know that driving a car is going to be much more expensive typically than taking public transportation. And when we were creating these estimates, we didn't want to estimate too far in one transportation direction. So given this challenge, we calculated our transportation expenses as the median or halfway point between the cost of driving a car and the cost of public transportation. So the cost of driving a car included several things. So it included the consumer expenditure survey data for gas, insurance, and vehicle maintenance for Californians. It's important to note that it did not include purchasing a car or leasing a car. That's not allowed actually in federal guidelines for cost of attendance. So the driving piece was looking at that. The driving piece also included the cost of an annual campus parking pass that we determined by researching each individual's campus's parking permit fees. And then for public transportation, we sourced the cost of a monthly bus pass from the local transit websites for each county or major metropolitan area. And then finally, we have books and supplies and personal expenses. So for books and supplies, there are indications that textbook spending and supply spending is decreasing, including what students themselves are reporting. However, when we looked at the responses from the CSAC Sears survey, we also saw that it was the case that 30% of California students reported actually not having enough money for books and supplies. So when we look at books and supplies, we can see that changes to the textbook landscape, like greater use of rentals and online materials and faculty who are more aware of student expenses, are shifting the costs down. But it also may be true that students are forgoing the purchase of books and supplies because they can't afford them, which would also bring down those average expenses. So all that to say, we intentionally chose to use national expenses for books and supplies that were higher than California averages or what was reported through the CSAC student expense budget, because we wanted to ensure that that expense actually met the needs of students. And finally, for personal expenses, we also sourced them from the Consumer Expenditure Survey data, and I'll share kind of the specifics of what personal expenses included on the next slide. This is just a reminder of some of the assumptions that I went over as we talk through the data. So housing, which includes utilities, it was a 2-bedroom apartment, and it was 50% cost of a 2-bedroom apartment per student. So we assumed that 2 students were sharing a 2-bedroom apartment, splitting the cost of rent and utilities equally. We talked about transportation costs and how we calculated them as the halfway point or median between the cost of driving a car to campus and the cost of taking a local bus to campus. And then personal expenses, that included a variety of costs necessary for students and life, including laundry, personal care products and services, apparel, cell phone services. We also estimated expenses that would be related to campus extracurricular activities like clubs or leadership activities. And then before we get into the data, I just wanted to call out that for some of the data that you'll see today and in the report, wherever we were comparing averages, such as across regions or systems, we used weighted averages using their fall 2023 enrollment data to ensure schools on either end of the enrollment spectrum weren't skewing those averages one way or the other. So before I turn it over to Laura to share kind of what we found from this data, just a reminder that the full list of our data sources with links and assumptions are in the report, and I encourage you to check them out. But I'll pass it over to Laura, who will share more about our findings.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. So as Megan mentioned, for the next several slides, we're going to share the key findings from our research on cost of attendance budgets and adjustments. So notably, we found that over half of California's public colleges and universities use cost of attendance budgets that are lower than what we estimated with our estimated regional costs. We found that just over 1/4 or 27% overestimated costs, and the remaining 20% had a less than 5% difference between what they published and what we calculated. As an example, one college in the greater San Diego area had a published cost of attendance of about $23,200, which was interestingly $8,000 less than what we estimated using our region-specific methodology that Megan just highlighted. Now, when we look by public higher education segment, we find that underestimating costs was the most common at the University of California, where all campuses underestimated costs compared to what we calculated through our methodology, followed by 77% of CSU campuses and 44% of California community college campuses. As mentioned earlier, UC bases its cost of attendance budgets in part on student surveys. And we'll note that with a very young student population, 84% of their undergraduates are not older than 21. Reported costs do tend to be lower than what older students report. As a result, the standardized budgets that are based on these surveys may not reflect the costs of older students, many of whom, for example, may have dependents and additional expenses. We also looked at the data by geographic region and, not surprisingly, found that colleges in higher cost areas of the state tended to underestimate college costs, again, compared to our methodology. Across all colleges in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Central Coast, Los Angeles, and Orange and San Diego counties, the enrollment weighted average differences between the cost of attendance calculated by this report's methodology and the college's published cost of attendance were more than $3,000. In contrast, colleges in the Central Valley, which tends to be lower cost area of the state, tended to slightly overestimate costs with an enrollment weighted average difference of about $1,000. Our analysis also revealed that at almost 1/3 of colleges, cost of attendance budgets did not keep pace with inflation between academic years 2017-18 and 2022-23. And I'll just note we use those because that was the most recent IPEDS data where we were able to run this analysis. We also observed that change in price varied considerably when examining individual cost of attendance components. So, for example, the change in living expenses at California colleges ranged from a low of 0, no change, to a high of 172%, with a median of about 34% across the colleges and universities. And for context, the California Consumer Price Index shows an increase of about 22% between those years. While some colleges do rely on the student expense budgets produced by CSAC, the lack of a universal methodology for calculating cost of attendance budgets contributes to large inconsistencies in costs across colleges and universities, especially those within the same region. In the example we have on this slide, we see that the total published costs that were from earlier this year at UC Berkeley were about $8,000 less than at Berkeley City College, which is just down the street. I think it's just a little over a mile away. And colleges do not typically make information about how cost of attendance budgets are calculated accessible. By looking at their posted budgets, it's often unclear what costs are included, such as whether transportation is based on driving a car or taking public transportation, and thus whether a student should bother to submit a cost of attendance adjustment to account for their actual expenses. So as you can see here, this is a screenshot of a college's cost of attendance budget. A student who and family who's looking at it would not know the assumptions that are underlying it. So now I will turn it over to Megan.
Great, thank you, Laura. All right. So we also looked at the cost of attendance adjustment policies. Remember, we did a review of the websites of all of the public colleges and universities in California. And we found that information about cost of attendance policies was not found, or we couldn't find it, for nearly 2/3 of institutions. And the accessibility and quality of the information providing for those remaining 1/3 institutions varied. So in terms of what that variation looked like, some schools linked directly to an adjustment form from their cost of attendance page. Others simply referred to its availability in a footnote. Sometimes colleges included a lengthy list of what the qualifying categories were for adjustments, like rent, car payments, childcare, other things like that, while others provided a much more limited list. So given the lack of information on campus websites, it was really hard for us to assess the degree to which institutions accept requests for cost of attendance adjustments, and even harder for us to assess whether those requests would typically be approved. So it was challenging for our understanding. It's also challenging for students who may need to access these processes. And as we noted earlier, as Laura noted earlier, the FAFSA Simplification Act is requiring several changes that support students' access to cost of attendance adjustments, which includes informing students about their ability to make such a request. So without, for the 2/3 of institutions who didn't have that information on the website, it's unclear if they're in compliance or if they're following the other components of the FAFSA Simplification Act. We also did interviews with financial aid administrators, with directors, and with foster youth support program. And what we found is that most administrators shared a similar cost of attendance process. Students make a request, typically through a form, and they submit documentation that explains their need for a cost of attendance adjustment. However, there's a wide variety in how each administrator approaches these adjustments. Some administrators exercise greater flexibility in which costs they were willing to include in a student's budget. And although this wasn't universal, we did see several bright spots in these interviews, including financial aid administrator collaboration with other student services staff, including those foster youth support programs, and a willingness to develop updated budgets that better reflect their student populations. So before we continue with our findings and our recommendations, I want to pass it now to our JBAY youth advocate and mentor, Erin, who will share her experiences with cost of attendance adjustments. So thank you so much, Erin, for being here. I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name is Erin, and I'm a former foster youth with experience in the juvenile justice system. I'm also a transfer student from Ventura College in my 4th year at UCSC, double majoring in both history and critical race and ethnic studies. In this chapter of life, I am so fortunate to fulfill many roles, but my favorite role is as a mom. So when I learned that I'd earned around $30,000 in scholarships, I felt so empowered. I guess I should clarify. In my first 2 years at community college, when I was getting ready to transfer out, I'd applied for many scholarships, and this empowerment led me to choosing my dream school, a school I once felt was unattainable for someone like me. With $30,000, I'd be able to pay my rent on campus and solely focus on school without the necessity to work to support myself and my family, meaning I'd have better grades and a greater chance of getting into grad school. When I learned in my first quarter at UCSC that I'd only receive a small fraction of these scholarships, I was chagrined, to say the least. My motivation completely capsized, and it became so much harder to focus on school, not knowing how I would simultaneously be able to stay financially afloat. The worst part of this experience was not understanding why I couldn't receive the full amount of the scholarships I had worked so hard for. Now, in this same first quarter, I was persistent in reaching out to the financial aid office for assistance. It felt very important to me to know where my scholarship money was going and why I couldn't access the full amount. When I was finally able to speak to the quote unquote outside scholarship specialist, he briefly told me about the cost of attendance appeal process and how I would need to appeal to be able to access more of my scholarship money. When I had reached out to the same officer at the time to get further guidance on what sorts of things can be used in the appeal, I couldn't get him to agree to meeting with me despite multiple requests. Overall, my experience working with the financial aid office was very poor. And though I understand they too probably have so much on their plate, it felt so debilitating at times to just have nobody on my side. Nearly a year and a half later, I was very fortunate to have found the help I needed within a volunteer-run organization on campus called the Smith Society that really dedicates itself to supporting current and former foster youth like myself. A volunteer in the organization actually happened to be a former financial aid officer at UCSC, and thus was just very knowledgeable about the process and what sort of things I could claim in my appeal. She sat on Zoom with me for an hour, looking at my financial aid summary and giving me insights I simply never could have known without her. Because of her help, I was able to get an additional $4,000 one quarter by successfully completing the cost of attendance appeal. I wouldn't say this is necessarily the normal amount a student could expect, but being a single parent that lives on campus does make my personal cost of attendance quite higher than the average student. I have become so passionate about this topic because I know what $2,000 to $4,000 extra could do for another student with dependence, and even a more traditional student who has never even heard the term cost of attendance. And I shudder to think about the students who aren't familiar with this process, like how they manage to survive without an accurate cost of attendance budget. Um, to conclude my thoughts and to reiterate much of what you've already heard, the average cost of attendance is far from accurate, and there really needs to be further investigation or auditing, especially geographically, to accurately determine how much it costs students to attend their higher learning institution. Additionally, the cost of attendance appeal process needs to be more transparent, more accessible, and it needs to be something our students and admin thoroughly understand. Um, if I had known then everything I know now, I would have had a significantly easier time navigating through my first year at UCSC. I know I shared a lot of my experience with you, Megan. Is there anything you feel like I'm missing or that I should add?
That was great, Erin. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being so open with us on the webinar and sharing your experiences. It definitely speaks to some of the challenges that students like yourself are facing when it comes to cost of attendance. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for being a trooper. Erin isn't feeling so great today. So thank you also for being on the webinar and powering through. We appreciate you. Great. Well, I am going to dive in with, I think, with Erin and Crystal's and Ella's kind of stories on our mind. I'm going to dive into our recommendations. And I think some of the themes that you'll hear are things that won't surprise you given what our guests have shared. So for institutions, our recommendations, our first part of our recommendations really focus on providing the most realistic and transparent cost of attendance budget that is possible. This is critical not only to ensuring that students have enough financial resources to support their basic needs and their academic needs, as Erin was talking about, but more accurate cost of attendance budgets also ensure that college financial aid office staff are less likely to have to field those numerous requests for adjustments for routine expenses like housing and transportation that might be more expensive in your community. So we're recommending that, to support more accessible budgets for colleges, that they should provide the basis for the amounts included in each category within their cost of attendance budget. So if an institution is relying on an external source, such as CSAC, that should also be noted, and whether you applied any adjustments, like you adjusted for CPI or you did a regional adjustments. And institutions that develop their own regionally customized budget should specify any assumptions made. So for example, looking at the budget, a student should be able to tell if the housing costs that are listed are for a shared 2-bedroom apartment or a single occupancy studio, and if they include all relevant utilities, including internet. We also just, as we've kind of looked, seen through our research, using singular data sources, for example, relying just on the statewide Sears student expense budgets, doesn't allow cost of attendance budgets to reflect those regional nuances of cost of living, or necessarily reflect a college's given student population. So as such, colleges should review and utilize multiple data sources to calculate their cost of attendance budgets and err towards higher costs when there are differences. We also note that, in general, expenses like housing and food and transportation are generally similar at colleges within the same geographic region. So thinking about that map with UC Berkeley and Berkeley City College, we would, colleges should cross-reference their cost of attendance figures with other higher education institutions in their community and adjust their budgets if they're notably lower than their neighboring institutions. We are also, thinking about for institutions, their policies and practices around cost of attendance adjustments. So first, we want to encourage colleges to establish broad criteria for making adjustments to cost of attendance and avoid setting those rigid restrictions on acceptable circumstances. So at a minimum, colleges should allow adjustments to the budgeted cost of any allowable expense, and many do, including housing, food, transportation, book supplies, and personal expenses. We also would like to see those policies plainly presented for students on financial aid award letters or websites, things that are places that are easily accessible for students to understand, and to advertise these policies in language that is also accessible, transparent, and encouraging, and should clearly outline the steps necessary to complete that adjustment process. And finally, as we've mentioned a couple times during this session, we also want to see that institutes are complying with statutory requirements, including the FAFSA Simplification Act, which Laura has talked about, that includes the provision that all higher education institutes develop policies and processes for reviewing professional judgment requests. So that's a lot of recommendations, and we also want to uplift that many colleges are also thinking about this work and doing things to address some of these recommendations that we've raised. We heard a little bit of this from Ella this morning. I also wanted to highlight Cal State Dominguez Hills, which has established a financial aid and affordability task force that includes actually equally represented by faculty, staff, and students to improve college affordability. So this includes, this task force has included listening sessions and student surveys to better understand who is being impacted by changes in tuition, including non-tuition costs. This task force has kind of 7 core approaches in all around college affordability, 2 specifically related to cost of attendance, including expanding college conversations around cost of attendance to include not just tuition, but non-tuition expenses as well. The other component of this task force also is looking at developing a more robust method for establishing those non-tuition costs. So excited to see what comes out of that financial aid task force and from Cal State Dominguez Hills. And I'll pass it on to Laura to talk about our recommendations on the state level.
Great, thank you so much. So it is critical that California ensures that all colleges and university systems establish a consistent and clear methodology to develop campus cost of attendance budgets that reflect the needs of student populations. Next slide, please. This methodology and process should be transparent by requiring colleges to publish their methodology, including data sources used and assumptions made, alongside cost of attendance budgets on college websites. Additionally, cost of attendance budgets should clearly outline all expenses that are included within broad expense categories, and colleges should be required to consult multiple data sources, including regional data whenever possible, to determine the most accurate costs. While recent FAFSA simplification provisions direct colleges to increase awareness about students' ability to request professional judgment, which includes modifying data elements in cost of attendance budgets, and requires that colleges consider students' requests for them, California can take steps to strengthen these efforts by requiring that 1, institutions prominently display information about cost of attendance adjustments in transparent and understandable language on key web pages and in financial aid award letters. 2, specify the types of adjustments that must, at a minimum, be considered, including adjusting the budgeted cost of any allowable expense to reflect a student's actual cost. For example, adjustments should be made when a student's rent or utilities exceed the standard allowance, or if a student uses a car as their sole form of transportation. And 3, accept a documented conversation between a student and a financial aid administrator about the student's need for a cost of attendance adjustment as sufficient documentation when obtaining third-party documentation is challenging or not feasible. And finally, and very, very importantly, we need to make sure that our financial aid offices are adequately funded to have the staff and the capacity to conduct research and construct accurate cost of attendance budgets, as well as make cost of attendance adjustments in a timely manner for students who request them. Our financial aid offices are working super hard year-round to help our students. They have a lot on their plates. The resources that are available for financial aid administration vary by campus and by segment. And it's really important that California ensure that they provide them with the sufficient funding so that they can assist students in capturing their true college costs and accessing all of the financial aid for which they're eligible. So we know, we see you, we appreciate how hard you're working, and want to make sure you have the resources to do what's necessary to construct the most accurate cost of attendance budgets. So with that, I will turn it over now to Megan for Q&A. I know both she and I will be answering questions, but I will turn it over to you, Megan.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. You're welcome to take some time now to enter any questions you might have in the Q&A portion of Zoom. I know that there are students on this webinar who might have questions about your individual circumstances or your cost of attendance at your particular college. And so just be mindful about sharing personal information in the Q&A, and we may not be able to answer those questions. So if you have those personal questions, definitely get in touch with your college financial aid office. Okay. So Laura, do you see any questions?
Yeah, I'm
that you
happy to.
wanna...
Yeah, happy to pop in. So someone had asked what's the difference with need-based aid. So need-based aid is financial aid that you can only receive if you have financial need. So you have your cost of attendance and you have your student aid index. And that student aid index is what you and your family are expected to contribute to college costs. So your financial need is your cost of attendance minus that SAI. That amount is what you can get in need-based financial aid. Let's see, I'm looking. Will JBAY publish regional costs of attendance for California each year? I don't think there's a current plan for that, but we can definitely register that if that's of interest. Megan, this might be a question for you, and then I can answer a few more after that. In terms of transportation, did you factor in the cost of travel between a student's college housing and the location of any off-campus employment? If so, did you make an allowance for mileage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it speaks to the complexity of how complicated sometimes these cost of attendance figures can be to calculate. So we didn't specifically include mileage of any kind of sort to campus or to employment. Just because that varies so individually by student, it was going to be pretty hard to calculate. But what we did calculate and include in our transportation figures is allowance for gas. So hopefully that would cover some of that need, or cover some of those mileage expenses that a student is taking on. Although if a student is traveling more for campus employment, that might be an area where they need to submit an adjustment because their expenses are more than what the college cost of attendance allows.
Great, thank you. Someone flags, and I think it's good to uplift that in regards to the Chafee grant specifically, starting this academic year, Chafee is no longer treated as other financial assistance. So that is helpful, and that is a great flag. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's see. Somebody asked about discussing scholarship displacement bill. I'm assuming they mean AB 288, which I think was from 2021. And what that bill does is it essentially says if you're a Pell Grant recipient, that if you get certain scholarship funds, that those funds can't supplant any institutional aid you're getting, right? So if like, I'm making these numbers up, but if you're getting $4,000 in institutional aid and you get $4,000 in scholarship, it can't be a wash. But that's also, the bill does not allow for people to get aid over their cost of attendance. So it doesn't address that issue of hitting the cost of attendance ceiling. Let's see, I'm looking through the questions. Megan, I don't know if you see any. Someone had noted the cost of attendance must be based on data from surveys or other agencies, organizations that in colleges have to substantiate how they came up with the totals to be in compliance with Title IV regs. And that's true. But you know, some colleges we've talked to have not had any issues with doing that. I know one of the people that financial aid director we interviewed in our report used data from rent.com in his area and just, you know, simply documented that that was how he did it. Another financial aid director looked at, I believe it was like 45 different kind of rental costs in their area and excluded the top and bottom 15 and then took an average and then just documented that.
Yeah, Laura, that kind of speaks to one of the questions here about like having recommendations beyond what we included in our methodology. So I think we, in our report, we do include a kind of a detailed list of the data sources that we used, and we encourage folks to check that out. But there are campuses that are working on their cost of attendance budget using some of the methodology that Laura described, using kind of more regional, more local, hyper-local data from rent.com or other places to develop their budgets.
I am seeing, I wanted to note, and this is something that I'm not aware of, so I'd have to look into, but someone did mention that you can award scholarships past cost of attendance if a student only receives Pell. That's something that I'll have to look into, but did want to note that the original person who posted that has mentioned that. Let's see. Looking through to see if there's any other questions that we haven't already answered. Megan, I don't know if you're seeing.
Yeah, just to clarify again about the mileage. So we did not include mileage cost data in our transportation. We only include expenses for gas. So I think that was a question that came up again. And I think as campuses are developing their own cost of attendance budget, if mileage makes sense to include, the IRS does publish the mileage cost data as indicated in the comments.
Someone had asked, what about proposing these changes to the feds? And I just want to note that right now, the feds allow quite a bit of flexibility for how colleges set their costs of attendance budgets. And so I think, you know, our intention with these recommendations is to provide institutions with ideas and tools for how they can construct their cost of attendance budgets and use sources that might be best for their population. So I don't know that we would necessarily want to have stricter federal requirements. Everything that we were talking about today are things that colleges can do now if they want to.
Laura, do you want to take that last question maybe about, we can review the slide about declining aid again? Maybe that would be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if we can go back to that. So someone wrote that they're still struggling to understand why students are having to decline aid. And again, a student can only get as much financial aid as their total cost of attendance. So if your total cost of attendance is $30,000, even if your actual expenses are $32,000, you can only get $30,000 in financial aid. You can't exceed that. And specifically, you can only get as much need-based aid as you have financial need for. So that's why we're saying that it's important that the cost of attendance budgets accurately reflect what students are actually paying. And that's why students make cost of attendance adjustments, because then that way, if that cost of attendance budget is exceeded, if that cost of attendance budget adjustment is approved, then they can receive those additional funds. So essentially, there are these standardized budgets that are already set. And then if a student says, hey, actually, this does not accurately reflect my costs, they can make an appeal. And then the financial aid office has the ability to use professional judgment to say, okay, well, based on what you're sharing with us, we think your expenses are higher than what we've set for a standard budget. Sure, that's okay, we approve it. And then you can receive the additional financial aid.
Just a couple questions about that declined aid too in the chat, Laura. So does the declined aid roll over? What happens to it?
So decline aid, just unfortunately, it's just not accessed for that given year. So that's aid that a student, if they have an actual, legitimate expense and their appeal is not granted, then they unfortunately cannot access the aid that goes over their cost of attendance. Someone also asked, when you appeal cost of attendance, are you appealing Pell Grant and Cal Grant? No, it's not that you're appealing the actual program. It's you're basically saying my cost of attendance is higher than the standard budget that the college has. And in order to be able to access financial aid, like I've hit my cap, I've hit the cost of attendance ceiling. If my additional costs are recognized, I can then receive additional dollars. So you're basically appealing to have your budget set higher, which then allows you to access more financial aid, but it's not about actually appealing specific financial aid programs.
Let's take 2 more questions, Laura, and then I think we can move on.
Yeah, just looking here. Do you have any suggestions of how colleges might be able to fund these additional expenses, allowances to cost of attendance? Well, I think kind of the next sort of phase of work is advocacy to strengthen financial aid, especially need-based financial aid. And what one of the things that inspired us to write this report was that certain populations of students, like foster youth, students experiencing homelessness, student parents, do have access to currently available financial aid that we are hearing from students they're not always able to access because they hit their cost of attendance limit. So right now we're really saying, let's make sure that we can help students access the aid that's already available to them. Then of course, there's other ongoing efforts around Cal Grant reform, et cetera, to increase need-based financial aid. And someone wrote, it seems that a documented interview by itself is perhaps not sufficient in all cases. The latest FAFSA simplification provisions and guidance from NASPA does say that you can have a documented interview between a student and a financial aid administrator, especially when a third-party documentation is not feasible. So that is allowed. Great. Well, I think we got almost everybody's questions, if not all. Megan, I don't know if there's any others you're seeing.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of great comments too about from students and from other folks just sharing their experiences. So want to highlight those. And I know we didn't get to everyone, but we can definitely save these questions. And folks can feel free to reach out to either of us. Our contact information is on the screen now if you'd like to have a further conversation with us. But definitely check out our report. And thank you all for being here and for going on this cost of attendance journey with us. It was great to have you starting this discussion around cost of attendance. And like Laura says, there's a lot of next steps and directions we could go. So we're glad to be here with you at the beginning, and thank you for all your support. Thank you for all your support of students. And as a reminder, we will be sending out this PowerPoint and recording to all registered attendees this week. So So thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, we hope you'll reach out with any additional questions, or if you have opportunities to partner to ensure the cost of attendance budgets are accurately reflecting students' true costs, so they can access all of the aid that they're eligible for. And also just want to say a big shout out and thank you to all of the financial aid administrators and student services staff out there. We know that you are doing so much incredible work to help our students. And, we would love to partner to ensure that we can help make sure that we have these student budgets that really accurately capture the students' costs. So thank you so much.